Welcome back. Let's continue from our last video. In the previous video you saw after Sidrain, an 8th level mage and former head of the Nixian magic tower, asked Dane to become his disciple. Dane struggled to make a decision. Unsure of what to do, he turned to his elder sister Arabella for guidance. Arabella listened intently, and upon hearing that Dane could perform first-level magic despite lacking a magic circle, she couldn't hide her astonishment at her younger brother's talent. Arabella admitted she knew he was gifted but hadn't anticipated such a display of ability. He went on to explain that the magic circle's purpose was primarily to purify and circulate mana, suggesting that perhaps his own mana was already naturally pure. Arabella nodded in agreement, finding his explanation logical. She then informed Dane that she had a way to verify his theory and would send him a magic stone through the transmission device in his room, instructing him to simply pour some of his mana into it. Dane happily acknowledged her instructions, also feeling incredibly fortunate to have such a supportive sister, thinking how kind she always was to him. He reflected on how mana had always fascinated him and how valuable the advice from a level 6 wizard had been. On the other end of the line, Arabella, as if a thought had just occurred to her, reminded him that if his magical abilities were known, he would undoubtedly attract significant attention at the academy. Dane responded with a hint of panic, expressing his desire to avoid such attention. Arabella confidently stated that it was inevitable, as talent naturally drew attention more than anything else. She assured him that if anyone dared to bully him at school, he should let her know, and she would personally deal with anyone who troubled her little brother. Arabella's confident tone sparked a memory in Dane. He inquired if it was true that she had broken the nose of a persistent admirer, the second son of the Duke. Hearing this, Arabella's expression hardened as she recalled the annoying man. She sharply told him never to mention that bastard's name again, her voice carrying an edge that made those around her glance at her cautiously. Noticing their stares, Arabella quickly lowered her voice and changed the subject, asking Dane if he thought his mana could become even purer over time, even without a magic circle. In response, Dane's voice wavered slightly as he admitted he wasn't entirely sure about that. Arabella nodded, suggesting she would look into it later. However, before she could continue her conversation with her younger brother, a female student approached from a distance, calling out to Senior Arabella that the professor was looking for her. Though reluctant, Arabella told Dane she had to go and would call him back later. Dane replied with an, "All right, see you later sis," adding that he would send the magic stone to her as soon as he could. Arabella acknowledged this before ending the call. After his sister hung up, Dane couldn't help but smile with satisfaction. He thought to himself that he was on the verge of experiencing a whole new world and hadn't even realized his mana was this pure, even wondering if he might possess the heart of a dragon as he placed his hand on his chest. Meanwhile, Sidrain was still sighing deeply, feeling utterly defeated as he had failed to convince Dane to become his disciple. He lamented that using mana to probe Dane had only made the situation worse. He had intended to leave earlier but felt compelled to stay until Dane accepted his offer. Sidrain pondered what he should do to persuade Dane, considering offering magical artifacts or sharing his extensive knowledge. However, he quickly dismissed these ideas, thinking they might be too much, and if Dane still refused, he would be left with nothing. The more he considered the situation, the more he felt like his hair was turning gray. Just then, Dane's voice echoed from outside the door, asking if anyone was inside and announcing his presence as Dane Sogres. Hearing Dane's voice, a flicker of hope ignited in Sidrain's eyes. He wondered what Dane was doing there and if he had finally come to accept his offer. Filled with anticipation, Sidrain called out for him to come in. Dane opened the door, walked in quickly, and stated that he had something he wanted to discuss. The old man, looking at Dane, assumed he had come to ask to become his disciple and smiled inwardly, confident that Dane would eventually seek out an 8th level great mage like himself, even chuckling with joy at the thought. But before Sidrain could say anything, Dane coldly corrected him, stating that wasn't the reason for his visit. Dane's smile vanished instantly and he clicked his tongue in annoyance, asking why Dane was there then. Hadn't he made it clear he wasn't interested in magic? Dane shook his head, clarifying that he wasn't uninterested in magic itself. Sidrain then inquired why he didn't want to be his disciple and if he had already found another master. But Dane shook his head again, stating he didn't have a master yet. At this point, even the most patient person would have felt frustrated. Sidrain thought to himself what this kid was playing at, and if not that, then what on earth did he want, grinding his teeth together as he spoke. But Dane wasn't there for a casual chat. He explained that he didn't know how to advance to the 2nd tier, and it was difficult for his sister to teach him from such a distance, making learning from Sidrain the most viable option. Dane reminded Sidrain in his thoughts that the old man still owed him a life. Seizing the opportunity, Dane continued, saying he didn't just want to be a regular mage. On the other side, Sidrain seemed to understand and asked if Dane wanted to become a magic warrior. Dane replied no, he wanted to become a mage, a warrior, an assassin, and a summoner. The old man's jaw dropped in shock, questioning if such a class even existed, scratching his head in disbelief. But Dane wasn't finished, adding that he also wanted to be a swordsman. At this, Sidrain could only shake his head, finding it ridiculous and overly complicated. He pointed out that Dane was still refusing his offer even though he didn't realize this was his only chance. Dane calmly replied yes, that was correct, his tone determined. Sidrain began to think deeply for a moment, muttering to himself that Dane was too persistent. However, in this perplexing situation, an idea seemed to form in his mind, thinking this might just work. With this in mind, Sidrain suddenly slammed the table and shouted, asking if Dane wanted a letter of recommendation, mentioning he had heard Dane wanted to enter the academy and that if he wrote a letter, Dane would be admitted directly. Sidrain spoke eagerly and Dane found the offer incredibly tempting, the conditions indeed very attractive. All right then, he sighed, suggesting they discuss the details. Sidrain eagerly called out, asking if he could make a condition. Hearing this, the old man smiled inwardly, knowing Dane had shown interest and thinking he had him now, ensuring he couldn't escape. He cheerfully told Dane to go ahead and speak. Dane, unfazed, then asked if Sidrain could teach him how second-tier magic worked. Sidrain proudly patted his chest, claiming to know all types of magic in the world. Dane replied, really? Then I'm counting on you, his voice filled with anticipation. Haha, no problem, the old man waved his hand dismissively, thinking to himself that Dane was still so young and a letter of recommendation or knowledge of second-tier magic was nothing to him. Eager to show off his vast knowledge, Sidrain suggested they start right away, adding that even though his health wasn't great, it didn't matter. All right, let's begin, Dane nodded in agreement. Sidrain thought gleefully that Dane had completely fallen into his trap. However, contrary to the old man's expectations, Dane wasn't as naive as he seemed. By the way, Dane said, I'll consider this as my way of repaying you for saving me in the forest. Hearing Dane's words, Sidrain's face went blank and he asked what he meant. Dane reminded him that Sidrain himself had said he owed him a life debt, so he could ask for anything he wanted and he had just stated it, a sly smile playing on his lips. The old man's eyes widened in disbelief and he asked about becoming his disciple. Dane shook his head, clearly stating no. Upon hearing this, no matter how clueless Sidrain had been, he finally realized that he had been tricked by a 14-year-old. He thought he had been fooled by a kid and as his mind raced, he realized something unusual in Dane's request. He then shouted, asking why Dane was asking for two things when he only owed him one favor. In response, Dane coldly said he didn't think so, explaining that first, he had saved Sidrain from the forest, and second, he had also removed the poison from his body. Moreover, he had even had to carry him back, but he wasn't even counting that. Dane confidently listed his deeds, making the old man's face pale as he thought about how cunning this kid was, groaning inwardly that his old age experience couldn't match the vitality of youth. Time passed quickly and the scene shifted to the training grounds. Because Dane had already outmaneuvered him, they were both there to practice magic. Of course, Sidrain wasn't planning to give up so easily, thinking that if he kept insisting and persuading Dane, maybe in the future he would change his mind and it would be a waste to let such innate talent slip away. He then began giving instructions, stating that condensing the mana core before the magic circle was insignificant. The important thing was being able to use magic even without the circle. He explained that the method of transporting second-tier magic he was about to teach was very complicated and many had given up at this stage, so he told Dane to focus and listen carefully, casting a proud glance at him. Dane calmly agreed. Sidrain thought to himself, looking at Dane's sparkling gaze, that he wouldn't let him achieve his goal that easily and would teach him some manners. Second-tier magic was on a completely different level from the first tier, requiring calculating the amount of mana, measuring the concentration of mana in the surrounding air, and even factoring in the condition of the body at that moment. Sidrain explained that the complexity was the reason most people gave up on learning magic, his voice steady with experience, while Dane attentively took out his small notebook and began jotting down important points. Observing this focused demeanor, a flicker of doubt arose in Sidrain's mind. He asked if Dane understood what he was saying, thinking surely Dane would soon beg him to explain it in simpler terms, envisioning a scenario where Dane would plead for more straightforward words. A smirk tugged at his lips as he spoke aloud, asking if Dane got the basic idea now. In response, Dane confidently nodded, stating that he understood he must learn a great deal, not just the mechanics of magic but also things he had yet to discover. Across from him, Sidrain was utterly stunned by Dane's unexpected response. He asked if Dane actually understood everything then, demanding he tell him about the laws of magic operations. Without hesitation, Dane kept writing while casually answering that the first law was coexistence, explaining that mana could exist simultaneously within the physical world and alongside other sources of mana and through coexistence. A mage utilized both their personal mana and the surrounding mana to perform magic. He continued, stating that the second law was conservation, explaining that if mana gathered sufficient material elements, conservation allowed it to manifest spells using various elemental attributes. As Dane continued to explain, throwing in his own elaborations, Sidrain froze, unable to believe his ears. He mused that this child not only grasped the essence of magic but also added his interpretations with remarkable insight, noting that most people found this tedious, but it didn't seem to bother Dane, wondering how someone like this could even exist, his heart sinking in astonishment. Since Dane had answered flawlessly, Sidrain decided to dive deeper into the lesson, explaining that with each level increase, magic became exponentially more complex. Instead of explaining further, he declared he would demonstrate, pausing briefly before waving his hand to the side, causing streams of blue energy to wrap around his arm. The strands quickly intertwined, forming a grid-like symbol with elegant precision. Looking at the symbol he had just created, Sidrain turned toward Dane and began to explain that this was an example of first-tier magic which could be cast using basic laws and simple principles. However, he continued, starting from the second tier, things changed significantly and first-tier magic couldn't even begin to compare. After this brief explanation, Sidrain proceeded to conjure larger streams of energy which swirled with numerous intricate and cryptic characters floating in the air, stating with calm authority that this was how second-tier magic operated. Dane's eyes followed the complex formations created by Sidrain's demonstration, and even he had to admit that the level of intricacy had jumped to an entirely different dimension. The threads of magic intertwined with a complexity that felt far more difficult than the theoretical knowledge he had read. His brow furrowed in thought as he tried to grasp the layers of intricacy. On Sidrain's side, the subtle change in Dane's expression brought a grin to the old man's face. He asked with amusement how it felt, explaining that this was second-tier fire magic, flame dart, and if Dane wanted to create more powerful spells, he must cast the same magic multiple times in quick succession. Sidrain thought with growing satisfaction that Dane looked surprised, guessing he had never seen second-tier magic in action before. He continued aloud, remarking that it looked complicated and that most people spent at least a year mastering the basics of first-tier magic before they were even capable of attempting second-tier spells. He added that no matter how brilliant Dane was at this stage, he could only understand fragments of it, and the key to advancing lay in grasping the laws behind the magic, without which no amount of power would help. Sidrain planned to observe Dane for a week and slowly explain the technicalities to him as these thoughts took shape in his mind, still underestimating the exceptional talent sitting before him. Should I give it a try? Dane's calm voice suddenly broke Sidrain's train of thought. Sidrain replied dismissively, fully expecting Dane to fail, saying it was going to be difficult but to go ahead. All right then, Dane answered, his tone composed. Drawing upon everything he had observed so far, he began to mimic Sidrain's actions. Streams of soft energy enveloped Dane's body, and to Sidrain's astonishment, the grid-like magical symbol quickly took form around him. This is first-tier magic, right? Dane asked, his voice untroubled. Yes, it is, Sidrain nodded, his expression betraying a flicker of surprise. Internally, he marveled that Dane had not only formed clearly defined lines and structured shapes with precise dimensions but had also done it so effortlessly, already mastering first-tier magic. On the other side, seeing the old man confirm his success, Dane calmly moved forward with casting second-tier magic. And this is what you just showed me, he stated as the energy surrounding him began to shift. The streams twisted and turned, perfectly replicating the intricate patterns of the second-tier magic that Sidrain had demonstrated moments ago. Sidrain stared in speechless disbelief at the sight before him, his mind racing, wondering if Dane had just replicated the mechanism of second-tier magic perfectly, grasping it immediately after watching him perform it only once. The thought left him struck with curiosity, and he finally voiced his question, asking how Dane had done that. Dane explained with casual ease that when he observed, he memorized the laws and patterns, and once he visualized the structure of the magic in his mind, it wasn't that difficult. Though his words were simple, Sidrain knew the reality was anything but. He reflected that this was absurd, beyond imagination, even for a magical prodigy like himself, as mastering second-tier magic took time and practice. But this boy, he manifested the spell perfectly without even relying on structured magical tiers. The sense of wonder hadn't even fully settled when Dane made things more intense, suggesting he would try using Flame Dart next. Wait, what? Sidrain blinked incredulously. Dane, however, didn't bother repeating himself. He raised both hands to either side, his expression focused as he gathered his mana. Streams of energy swirled around him, forming brilliant trails of light. Carefully guiding the flow, Dane manipulated the mana into a series of fiery formations. In a sudden burst of power, four blazing arrows materialized, hovering around him like spectral guardians. Flames crackled along their forms as they stabilized in perfect alignment. Watching this flawless execution, Sidrain felt a surge of emotion he hadn't experienced in years, pure amazement mixed with disbelief. Dane glanced at his creation, a slight smile forming on his lips. "It looks like it worked," he remarked with quiet satisfaction. Back with Sidrain, watching the young boy beaming with joy as his magic successfully took form, the old man could only feel a profound sense of disbelief, thinking it was impossible and ridiculous, musing that if he had possessed talent like that, he could have reached the pinnacle of 9th-tier magic by now. Unaware of the storm brewing in Sidrain's thoughts, Dane casually controlled the flaming arrows, drawing them closer to himself before turning and asking if he was doing it right. "Ah, yes, very impressive," Sidrain answered, coughing a bit to mask his amazement, adding that Dane learned everything he taught remarkably fast. Even Dane seemed surprised by his own progress, admitting he was also astonished to succeed on his first try. Meanwhile, Sidrain felt a growing sense of trepidation, realizing this boy's terrifying talent, a mage who bypassed magical tiers, would cause chaos in the world if his abilities were exposed. He decided he must hide Dane's powers to protect him from those who would seek to exploit or manipulate him, especially until he could secure him as his disciple. "All right, let's move on to the next spell," Sidrain declared. "Yes, sir," Dane responded eagerly. Thus, the day continued to fly by and soon night fell. He was already planning how to write a recommendation letter to the prestigious academy. Lying in bed, Dane's thoughts drifted back to the morning lesson. He mused that learning magic was more enjoyable than he had expected and that he needed to master both theory and practice, but having the ability to wield magic now was incredible. He reflected on his past life where he had been forced to abandon magic, leaving him no choice but to wield a sword, never knowing when death would come, and magic requiring extensive study before yielding practical results was a luxury he couldn't afford. But this time he thought he could immerse himself in both practice and knowledge, combining what he learned from his sister with his innate talent growing explosively with even the simplest guidance, and with a former tower master teaching him, he wondered what magic he would learn tomorrow, the thought filling him with excitement. He fell asleep. Time passed quickly, and 2 weeks later Sidrain and Dane found themselves in discussion with another figure, Arkan. "What? You want to make magical potions?" Arkan exclaimed in astonishment. "Yes," Dane replied calmly, "but since I lack some of the materials, I'll need to venture outside the estate to gather them." Beside him, the tower master Sidrain confidently affirmed, "Don't worry about the boy, he's already grasped the mechanics of 4th-tier magic." Turning back to Arkan, though he was well aware of his son's extraordinary talents, the man couldn't help but marvel every time he heard of Dane's accomplishments, asking if it wasn't supposed to take a whole month just to master 1st-tier magic and magical reagents, and where Dane had even learned about those, as that wasn't exactly common knowledge. In response to his father's curiosity, Dane flashed a radiant smile, explaining that he had learned by reading magical texts in the library, which had fascinated him. Hearing this, Sidrain chuckled heartily, a broad grin spreading across his face, saying that just as he thought only a genius would be curious about magical reagents, as most people found them dreadfully boring, but for Dane even the simple act of gathering materials must be fun. Across from them, Arkan watched the exchange in silence, his expression thoughtful. After a moment he nodded in agreement, saying that it would be a valuable experience for Dane, and that since he would be leaving the estate, he should take the chance to inspect the territory while he was at it. With his eyes gleaming with anticipation, Dane responded, "Yes, father." That's a wrap. The story continues in my next video. Like and subscribe to stay notified.